There is something happening in people's lives. They are being called to things that have notoriously been considered unconventional, the dark, magical, and spiritual side of life. They are seeking life's answers, and so are we. I'm Stephanie Long.
And I'm Kendall Shahan.
And we're investigative journalists who want to break the norm of society's views of what we don't know or understand. We're the conduit for people to share their message that is otherwise considered taboo. The world is a mysterious place full of unexpected miracles, so join us in investigating the unknown. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you, Malia, for coming on. Malia Miglino is a grave hunter and history enthusiast.
Yes.
So if you just want to go ahead and introduce yourself further and tell us how you got into it, that would be great.
Sweet. Hi. Yeah. I'm Malia, and I kind of have an interesting background. So I'm traditionally an actor, makeup artist that decided to start making her own content because I was tired of bugging my friends with all my creepy historical facts that they didn't care about. So I kept getting pushed to make videos about it. So about 5 years ago, I started my first series called Macabre Mondays, where I featured historic locations that just felt innately creepy, haunted, whatever. And I just really wanted to answer the questions like, why does this place feel creepy? So I did a lot of research, and that show ran for 3 seasons. And through a series of strange events, because I love to frequent cemeteries, it's where I would find, sometimes like for Macabre Mondays, my leads would start with a location, or it would start in a graveyard. I would find an interesting headstone. I would do some research on the person, and sometimes that would have a trickle down effect, and I'd find this amazing location they were attached to. And then I realized this was something that I was just doing often. And then a good friend of mine had a documentary about a cemetery in Ventura that is historic, and it was a classic poltergeist situation. They removed the headstones and they didn't remove the bodies. And that just kind of led me down a path of realizing this is happening all over the country, where historic cemeteries, they're removing the headstones. Sometimes they remove some of the bodies, but most of the time they leave the bodies there and turn them into a park or put on top of put a Walmart there. So I kind of started to set off to educate people on different cemeteries and why we should preserve them, or, bring headstones back, or at least bring markers to historic places that are cemeteries, even if they're now parks.
That's so interesting. And then they can just do that and not tell the family and remove the headstone without moving the body with it, or how?
Yeah. It's complicated. So when you get into a lot of the historic cemeteries or pioneer cemeteries, a lot of the times those descendants might not exist anymore, or it's so many generations past that if they can locate family, they don't necessarily always care. So if they do tell them, hey, we're going to be transitioning this cemetery, they make the family pay to exhume and remove the bodies.
What?
Which is very expensive.
Yeah.
Very, very expensive. So a lot of people can't afford it. And a lot of the times they can't find descendants. So they, there's so many horrible situations where, like there's a cemetery in Colorado, in Denver, actually, that the people wanted to turn this old cemetery into a park. So they put out an ad in the newspaper like, hey, whoever wants to come exhume the bodies will we'll pay you something. So they sold it to the top, like the smallest bidder. And there's horrifying photos of, the bodies being exhumed, people taking pictures of the remains. Of obviously grave robbing happened because if people were buried with effects, people would take them, and they were just kind of thrown into other boxes. And most of the time the headstones are destroyed or thrown away. And it's devastating. Like, it's absolutely devastating, but it is an expensive and time consuming process to exhume remains. So a lot of times they just leave them and they just remove the headstones.
Wow. And another reason why I want to be burned.
It is a good argument for cremation. Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't want to be exhumed at some point, and someone I don't know, very far down my family line has to decide whether or not they're going to pay to move me or just leave me there.
It's a nasty situation. It's really awful.
Yeah.
Totally. And when you investigate graves or you pick a headstone, how do you go about it? Do you look at the one that, there's big, beautiful ones that have angels or really cool statues. How do you go about choosing one?
I mean, usually it's the oldest ones that I can find. I will definitely gravitate towards the older section. But sometimes like you kind of get a vibe off of something, or I see a particular name that seems strange, or especially since I'm here on the West Coast. So I predominantly frequent the cemeteries out here. If I see people, from England or from the East Coast, I really start to get curious, like, why did you come out here, in 1890? Mm-hmm. So stuff like that really fascinates me, or especially if I find, families where like there's 5 kids. And I'm like, okay, what's happened here? Mm-hmm. So it usually starts off with, either, it looks cool, or it's older, a name's fascinating, a place of origin's fascinating. Or if it has like a really strange like phrase or message on the headstone, then I'm kind of like, okay, somebody paid, because you basically pay per letter on a headstone. So somebody invested in this saying, and I want to know why.
I know my grandma bought her and my grandpa's, they got 2 for 1. So she was like, I'm gonna buy it now.
Oh, no.
What a great deal. What's your process though when you get to the cemetery? Do you just start walking through and feeling it out, or do you see something immediately and walk straight to that?
It's a bit of both, honestly. I will say usually my eye is caught by something, and that's where I'll start, because especially if you find like a large cemetery, you need to kind of focus in and have some kind of place to start, because it can be really overwhelming, and it's often overwhelming. Like literally, and then obviously when I go to a cemetery, I don't have the time while I'm there to pick, all the ones I want to do. So I just take, I have thousands of photos in my phone of headstones that I still have to go back and research, because I just will end up finding so many that I want to know the stories of. So it usually is, I'll pick a section and I'll start there and I'll start fanning out. Sometimes I have to go back different days, because you just can't cover all that ground in one day. It starts to get really stressful if I'm traveling and, I happen upon a really great cemetery, and it's like, I have an hour before I got to get somewhere, and that's it. And then, then I go into a little bit of freak out mode, because I want to see everything and I can't. But yeah, I usually just start with one section and fan out.
And do you usually go by yourself when you do it?
I would say probably 75% of the time I'm in the cemeteries by myself, mainly because most of the people in my life aren't as
interested into that. Yeah.
Because they know we'll be there for a long time. Like, it's not usually something that I can rush through. Like last year, my poor boyfriend, we were in London and Paris. It's like, I don't think he anticipated the amount of time we spent in graveyards, but you'd think you'd get it by now.
Yeah. Is there a cool story that you found along with one of the headstones?
Oh my goodness. I found one in the Santa Barbara Cemetery a few weeks ago, and I've just started like preliminary research, because it was basically this kind of nondescript, small, older headstone that I found. And next to it was this beautiful monument, which most of it had been rubbed away. It was so old you could barely read it, but I could make out kind of some of the names. But it was the daughter, like this little, I think she was 3 years old when she passed. It was her headstone that I was most attracted to. So I took a picture of it so I could go back and research. I started my research and realized that, she was the only daughter out of 9 kids from this one family that is so involved in American history that like my brain hurt, because the more layers I went back, like they had family members in every war going back to the Revolutionary War. Like one of their ancestors planted the Liberty tree, which predated the Liberty Bell. and it just kept unfolding. So I literally have like a Google folder of all of these articles that I want to go back to, because the story of this little girl and how she passed, and her father, who had moved out, was one of the first people to move out west from the East Coast. This is so crazy. I'm sorry. This one headstone led to so many crazy things. So her father was the cousin of this gold mine owner of a mine that I visited just a few months ago, randomly in Northern California, which was one of the neatest mines I'd ever been to, because it was pretty much completely intact. And it was it was hard rock mining. So they brought in a lot of Cornish people from Cornwall, England, because they were experts in hard rock mining. So his cousin founded this place that I became obsessed with. And it was just one of those places where I'm standing at this poor little girl's grave, whose ancestors are just threaded through American history that we're all taught. Like, they had significant parts. Like, another one of her ancestors is considered the martyr of the Civil War. It was this Confederate soldier that ended up being like hung for treason when he tried to switch sides. It was crazy. So that is the one headstone I will say that absolutely blew my mind for how many people it connected me to. And I haven't decided exactly how I want to tell that story when I know all of it, but I have to do something because it's just unbelievable.
Do you ever feel like you bring home any spirits when you go to the graves?
Yes and no. I try really hard to be as respectful as I can. I'm very sensitive to energies. I always have. And there's been times where I've entered a graveyard or a section and it feels wrong. So I don't spend much time there. But, you know, I'm one of those people that talks to the spirits if they're there, and I kind of let them know I'm entering their space, and to please not come home with me. Like, I will say that because I really don't want to. However,
agreed.
I definitely think things pass through my current house. And I'm not sure if those are things that I have brought with me or if this is just some kind of passing through situation for them. But I try to do as much as I can to not bring anything home or not have something attached to me. Although I think sometimes it's hard for me to decipher if I have or if I've just gotten really attached to a story and a person. And then I think I might start sensing them. Obviously, the hope is that I'm not sensing them, that they have passed on and they're not attaching to me. But when I get really invested in a story and I'm spending so much time looking up their history, saying their name, retelling their story, it becomes like, you know, are they here or am I imagining it or am I just too close to the story?
Oh my gosh, I never thought about that.
Well, I was wondering specifically because you were talking about it's because of the little girl you're researching this, and I was thinking she might attach on to wanting her story told. And she didn't live a very long life, so that
it could be. And you know, sometimes I will say that there are certain stories that I end up feeling really compelled to tell. And not because they necessarily have something incredible necessarily happen in their lifetime. There's just something about that person that I feel is important to tell. So in situations like that, when it's not like this really grand story or a historically significant thing, although one of my biggest things that I always say is every story is important. It does make me wonder, like, why is this one nagging me so much? Like, there's this one situation, there's a town out here called Redlands that has a lot of beautiful Victorian homes. And there's this unbelievable Victorian called the Maury Mansion. And the story of this house and the man who built it for this woman that he married, he was obsessed with her. He had a dream of her and then like met her days later and basically proposed marriage right away.
Oh, cool.
Very interesting.
Crazy story. So years ago, in my very first season of Macabre Mondays, I did an episode on the Hotel del Coronado in San Diego. And one of the things I talked about was a man that had gone there because he was totally distressed about the loss of his wife. And he shot himself, unfortunately. Years later, I'm in Redlands because I hear there's Victorians, and I find this Maury Mansion. I don't connect the two. And I'm just in awe of this home. And then I decide, this is a beautiful love story attached to this house. I want to see if I can find where they're buried. So I did. I went to their grave. They're buried side by side. It's beautiful. And then I realized this was the story I told years ago of the man that had shot himself because his wife died and he couldn't handle it. And it was just this really, like, I get chills thinking about it. There's something about their story in particular that I think is just wrapped in so many beautiful elements. And unfortunately, the house has gotten this really negative rap because people call it like the haunted house, when for me, that's not what it's about. It's this absolutely beautiful love story that, ended in tragedy, but started with love. And I think that's what's so important about their story. And I want to tell it so badly, but to be able to tell it, I would need to have access inside the home. And the current owners, because there's such a bad stigma surrounded around the house, really don't like to talk about it, which is really unfortunate. But it's one of those stories that for years now, I feel like I've kept crossing their path. And I really want to bring their story, not just like the haunted house element, but like the actual story to light.
I was just going to ask if it was
That would be
a
fascinating.
tour.
Sorry?
Oh, I was just going to ask if it was a place you could tour, but you said somebody owns it now.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think they had one show was allowed there, like a ghost paranormal show, and they felt it was very disrespectful and it brought in a lot of people around it. So they basically just like put the kibosh on it, which is such a bummer. So I've thought about writing them like a handwritten letter of like, this is why I want to tell this story. I don't want to talk about it being this creepy haunted house. I love the owners, the people that built this house.
Yeah.
Whenever I want to make a point, I handwrite letters. So
I think it helps.
Yeah. I mean, it's old school, but I've got a lot of responses versus email. So I recommend.
I think it shows somebody that like you really took time with this. Like you wrote a letter, you bought stamps, and you sent a letter.
Yeah. And my hand cramps out of the first sentence, So it's like crazy. Do you go to the graveyards during the day or night, or do you have a preference?
I mean, I prefer day only because, especially if you're touring historic ones, it's so hard to read some of those headstones. And a lot of them are closed at night. And I really just try to be respectful as much as possible. Like there's a couple cemeteries that are closed, like always closed here, that I have considered finding a way in under the cover of night, because it's the only way I will get to view these, because they've had so much vandalism and stuff that they've just shut them down completely. And people get very protective over their graveyards, which I respect and I understand, but I'm also, I guess, selfish because I love to see people's stories and see where they've ended up. And I like to bring those stories to light. So if you shut me out, I get a little frustrated.
Yeah.
But I do tend to follow the rules as much as possible. And daytime, just pragmatically, it just makes it so much easier. But there's definitely some graveyards where I'm like, this would be rad to come back at night.
Yeah.
Do you know why those graveyards have had such vandalism? Is there famous people there or something?
There's no famous people, but there's a lot of local legends, and it's just become, especially like there's this little private one in Pomona, in the city of Pomona, that's like basically underneath a freeway at this point. And it's like this little sliver of an old graveyard for a city that used to exist that no longer exists.
Oh, interesting.
And there's a lot of local legends tied to a resident that used to exist. So it was the place where local kids went to try to like conjure or see the spirit. There's a lot of alleged hauntings that take place in this cemetery. And, people would go there and they would drink and they would have seances and they would, break the headstones. And because of all of that, over I think some 50 plus years of it, they've just shut it down.
I see.
Gotcha. Do you have any scary stories from when you're visiting these graveyards?
Not so much with the graveyards. Honestly, I think for me, it's more, I will get affected emotionally more than anything. So I will leave some I will be really sad. Like sometimes every once in a while I'll get really choked up from a section and I don't know why. There's just like a really heavy sadness that I take away with me. But I will say in Highgate Cemetery in London, that place kind of tripped me out a bit.
Ooh, tell us about that.
It was, it was a bucket list place for me and it was so overwhelming. And it's one of those places where, unlike most of the cemeteries here, where it's like you kind of, you buy your land and that should be your land forever. There, when you are buried there, the family signs something that basically says, you're renting this plot. And in 70-ish years, we're probably going to add somebody to this because there's just not enough land. So most of the graves in Highgate are at least 4 bodies deep. And of course, you have, all sorts of horrible pandemic victims and just all sorts of tragedy of victims buried in that cemetery. And it's so crowded, but so beautiful that the entire time you just kind of feel like you're surrounded. It was the first place I've ever been where, because you have to take a tour there, you can't just wander because it's such a sight. Yeah. But it just kind of felt like that feeling constantly that you're being watched. So I had this sense constantly like to be extra respectful. Like it felt like I was entering into somebody's private home and everybody was watching me. Like, don't touch the sofa, don't touch that, don't touch that, don't touch that. And I was just kind of juggling these emotions of being just totally nerding out and being so excited. And also like, I'm so sorry, I'm in your space. Like, I'll get out of here as soon as I can. Like, I'm so sorry. It was a trip. Like it was a trip to put it mildly.
How do they do the gravestones then if there are 4 deep? Do they like line them up back to back?
They'll flip them. So if you have, so for like the first 2, they'll have the engraving of one. And then when they put a new body, they'll flip it and engrave that one. But you will see some that are just kind of, stacked like dominoed. It's crazy. It is something to see. I'm telling you, it's nuts.
Have you ever stumbled upon a serial killer?
No, but I'll tell you, I went and saw Sharon Tate's grave a couple weeks ago. And that was crazy, especially because she's down the line from Bela Lugosi. And I was just like, I became totally lost in this. Oh, and Dean Martin was also kind of in the same row. And I'm like, what a strange reality that these 3 people ended up within the same vicinity of each other. And Sharon Tate and what happened to her is something that's always just haunted me so deeply. That one was just rough to like stand there and process what had happened, but no serial killers. But I'll tell you, the day I'm at HH Holmes' grave will be I will nerd out. I am about
serial killers, but I haven't heard that name. Who is that? If you don't mind telling.
HH Holmes is they call him the America's original serial killer. And in 1893 in Chicago, he built what they call the murder castle. He essentially built a hotel that was designed for death. There was hidden gas lines in the rooms. He had a special furnace built to incinerate the bodies, and then he would sell the skeletons to medical schools.
Yeah, it was crazy.
So he made a profit.
I'm embarrassed, and I love watching serial killer stuff. But.
He is a trip. He's awful. He's horrendous. But if you want to talk about serial killers, his ingenuity and his imagination for how to kill kind of saw no bounds. So if that's kind of your jam, I would definitely suggest delving down.
I don't want to sound like weird or sadistic, but I it's interesting to me.
Oh, me too.
I just haven't heard of him.
people always joke that I love death, and I don't love it in that way. I'm just fascinated by the things that humans are capable of doing to other humans.
I agree with you on that one. What does Sharon, I am curious, what does Sharon Tate's grave look like? Can you describe it? I'm just curious.
It's I can actually send you a picture of the headstone, but it's very modest. It's just a flat headstone. I think there's 6 other people that are buried in that same vicinity. So I'm not sure if they were cremated. I'm assuming they were probably cremated. So I think there was 6 people in that one little plot.
Okay. Yeah, we'd love to see a picture.
Yeah, I'll definitely send it.
Since I can't get there, obviously.
Yeah.
Have you ever done any research on the Winchester woman, Sarah Winchester?
Yes, I'm obsessed with her. I always have been.
And I feel like you might know some stuff. So
she's she was kind of, I guess you could say, my gateway into being obsessed with all of this. I became obsessed with her when I would say like 6. So like I begged my parents to take me, because I'm from Seattle originally. So we drove down to visit the Winchester.
That's where we live by.
What?
Yeah.
Seattle!
Mm-hmm. I know.
That makes me so happy. I'm so homesick. I miss home so much. But yeah, so I'm a huge fan of hers. I think for me, I actually subscribe more to the notion that she followed more of Baconian theory instead of it being all about hauntings. So I think there's a whole other school of thought surrounding the house and why she put in certain things that aren't just paranormal. And I haven't finished my research on it to like conclusively say this is 100% what I feel. But I definitely think that there was something else going on with her that wasn't just, terror of these spirits killed by the Winchester rifles. So I think it's fascinating, and it's not something that I've really seen other people explore, because we all love the idea of it just being this house built to confuse spirits. But there are some pretty interesting things that point to that not being the reason at all, and a lot of having to do with her growing up, because she was highly educated and she was trained in a lot of things that women aren't traditionally trained in. So her story as a human is so much more than like this widow that was terrorized by spirits and, would sit in her seance room every night. Like that's a part of her story. Like we know she did that. But I think there's more to it that, again, I'm so obsessed with people's stories. I don't think we've gotten the full story of Sarah Winchester, because we've all loved the idea of what we've already put out and have pegged her as. But I think delving more into her past and rounding out who she was is just as fascinating and doesn't take away from the fun creepiness that we all love surrounding the Winchester.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think that's with anything in life. We have this opinion, and then once it gets shattered, it's like breaks our bubble, I guess.
Exactly.
Because I agree there's more to Sarah Winchester than what meets the eye. That's why I'm fascinated. I can't wait till you finish your research, because I want to read it. It's kind of like Jack the Ripper, all these theories come out, and he's probably some just normal guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not normal because he killed, but you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Your average Joe, nothing. I didn't mean normal, excuse me. Just your average Joe, that nothing like sexy that they make it out to be.
Yeah, because you get somebody like that, and it does become sexy. We romanticize this, cloaked killer in Victorian London. It was something. We haven't, human beings, I really don't think we've come that much further than like the Victorians with the penny dreadfuls. We all have a sense of morbid curiosity. We just do. It's a part of our life cycle. Like, to not be fascinated by death would, to me, it's like all of a sudden us not caring about the birth of a baby. To me, it's just two ends of the same spectrum. Mm-hmm. And we think of that as being this amazing thing. And so it's like, yeah, death is tragic, but it's still a part of our cycle. And I think it should stop being so taboo for people that are fascinated about it.
Agree 100%. And you're also taxed on it, so you should.
It ain't cheap to die. It's not cheap to die.
I know. My father died and it was quite expensive.
I'm
to
sorry.
cremate him. But yeah, I agree with you 100%. Do you have any other historical people you found at gravesites?
Oh man. I mean, a myriad really of people that I love. So I have another obsession on top of all my many obsessions. I'm obsessed with madams of Victorian brothels. Love them.
Oh yeah.
Oh, me too, actually.
Right? Like they are the original hustlers.
Don't even get it. Oh God, don't even get me started about brothels. Okay.
I'm obsessed. So anytime I go somewhere that, I know there's one of the famous madams buried, I have to go visit.
Yeah.
There's, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the name. I'm totally drawing a blank. When I went and did my first episode of Grave Hunter out in Victor, Colorado, I took a stop over in Cripple Creek and I visited, oh my goodness, why can't I think of her name? It's Pearl something. Pearl DeVere. She had a brothel that was like the most expensive brothel in Cripple Creek. You essentially had to prove that you made, I think it was like upwards of a lot of money, but essentially it cost about $1,000 a night to be with one of her ladies.
Whoa.
And you had to have proof of income.
Especially in that time. Oh my God.
Wow.
Yeah. She was not planned. She was absolutely not planned. And, prostitution was never legal, but she had so much money and she kept that city afloat because, yeah, it's a mining town, but there's highs and lows. So she funded the banks. She was handing out money to everybody. When a miner died, she'd be the first person at his wife's house, with food and money. She was just absolutely revered by that community. And so her grave, they had to put a fence around it because so many people would bring her gifts. If you go to her grave, and she's been dead for well over 100 years, her grave is just littered in pearls and different mementos, and people would go there and bring different alcohol for her. Her funeral was the largest one ever in Cripple Creek. Everybody came out. There was a police procession.
Well, they aren't going to put down the brothel because she's funding them, so it's kind of like a catch-22 on that.
Exactly. It's so good. Actually, one of my favorite madams is the reason why Seattle has a public school system.
Oh, really? Tell us. What's that story about?
Madam Lou Graham, she was a trip. She also had one of the most expensive brothels in Seattle. When the fire happened, her brothel was the first building rebuilt.
Very important.
Very important. Very important.
It really generates a lot of income. If we look at it.
It does. She also founded one of the first banks in Seattle. She was funding a lot of the building that was happening, but there's a lot of controversy around her because it's pretty much confirmed that she was a lesbian. And when she kept making money and more women started moving to Seattle, after all the men were there for the timber and whatnot, when more women came out, they really were hating that their husband was spending so much time at the brothel. And they just really kind of pushed her out of town. So she moved back to San Francisco, where she died under kind of mysterious circumstances. Nobody's been able to confirm exactly how she died. But her money, all of her tons of money, were left to probably her partner, who she called her assistant. Mm-hmm. But that money, there's a lot of conflicting stories about exactly what happened to her money, whether it went into the hands of the state. Some people say that's what happened. Other people think that her partner had it. But either way, somehow that money funneled its way into creating the Seattle public school system.
Wow. That's fascinating.
It's so
and
funny.
What happened to her brothel?
Totally.
Nowadays, do you know what it is?
Her building is still there. It's in Pioneer Square. I can get you the exact address.
Why did I say Pioneer Square?
Yeah.
Of course.
I just felt like you were going to say that. Did she open another brothel though in San Francisco? Do you know?
They don't know.
Or she just went there and kind of just went like
I think
and then died.
her life definitely took a turn for the worse, like absolutely took a turn for the worse. I don't think she was that profitable because she had started her kind of career in San Francisco. And when she heard about what was going up in Seattle and how it was one of the stops for people on the way to the Klondike and all of that, she was just smart enough to know, hey, men are going to need some hobbies. So she took a trip up north.
Good for her for capitalizing on that.
Why not?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
As a lady, you didn't have much choice back then. So
yeah, be a wife or make a buck, you know?
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you give a shout out to our listeners on how they can get connected with you?
Yes. You can follow me on Instagram at Macabre Mondays. I post everything there. I post frequently. Anything I post on YouTube or any other socials always also finds its way to Instagram. So it's probably the one-stop shopping for everything that I do. And I Insta story from cemeteries all the time. So there's just a ton of content constantly going up on my Instagram.
Love it. Well, thank you so much. It was so fascinating hearing your stories. And what you're doing is so great.
I love it.
Thank you, guys. This was a blast.
Yeah, you're awesome.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.